Hello and welcome back to Bookish and welcome to my video about my top 10 novels that I read in 2022. As always, these are not necessarily novels that were published in 2022. These are just the novels that I read in 2022, which I thought were the 10 best. This was a pretty tough competition for me. As you know, I love to do videos about the number 11, so I was tempted to, make a video about the top 11 books I read this year or novels I read this year, but I decided to go traditional and I stuck with 10. So here are my 10 in ascending order. So 10 being the lowest rated of these excellent books that I read and number 1 being the highest. At number 10, I have The Beast They Turned Away by Ryan Dennis. This is a novel set in Ireland, and it's an Ireland that is changing. It's a small village Ireland in which the modern world is intruding more and more, and an older generation is being replaced by a younger generation with slightly different values. And that is creating problems because there's still a fair amount of superstition. And the superstition centers on this little boy who an old man, the toughest old man in the community, has kind of taken in to raise. And this little boy wears literally a cow skull around everywhere he goes. And the people in the village think there's something wrong with him. They think he's kind of like bad luck, that he's the source of problems. And we have this kind of old man who is really good at the Irish sport of hurling, who in some ways is like Cuchulainn from the great Ulster cattle raid epic, the Toyn, which is a big part of Irish history. Anyway, it's just, I thought, just an incredibly effective, memorable story with really brilliant images, which stayed stuck in my mind, and I thought it was really excellent. At number 9, I have Small Things Like These. I did a whole review of Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, and I just think it is kind of an excellent book in which, emotion and the prose have been distilled down to near perfection. It tells the story of a collier in small town Ireland. It's kind of a theme here, I think, in small town Ireland, who discovers a terrible injustice, something terribly wrong is going on, and he has to decide, whether to put his entire life, his income, his family in a kind of financial risk to try to do something about it. It's just really powerful, I thought, really beautifully done, and just kind of a perfect kind of, tiny little novel. At number 8, I had The Death of Vivek Ochi by Kweke Emeze. Emeze is, one of those writers who I think is incredibly talented. I know most people I've talked to and most people here on BookTube seem to really prefer Freshwater to The Death of Vivek Ochi, but for me, The Death of Vivek Ochi was just really, really moving. And I thought Emeze's ability to create time and place and kind of raw emotions which verge on melodrama, and I know for some people they kind of tip over the edge to melodrama, is just really, really incredibly. It's set in Nigeria, and the focus of the story is a trans woman who is trying to come to terms with that in a society which really doesn't accept that, in which her status as a trans woman literally puts her life in danger, as the name implies, and then really kind of looks at members of her family and her friendship group and their willingness or unwillingness to come to terms with that, and increasingly her unwillingness to live a lie, to live as a man. I just thought it was really incredible, really emotionally powerful, and again, a really sense of place and culture that I just found to be really great. At number 7, I have Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. This is my second Jesmyn Ward novel. I really like Sing Unburied Sing, which I read a few years ago and may be in my top 10 list. I just think Jesmyn Ward is a remarkable author, even though I only read 2 of her books. Both of them have been outstanding. This story surrounds a young girl named Esh. I believe she's 14, and she lives essentially in incredible poverty, and with her brothers and her father, who is, not necessarily the greatest parent in the world, and her brother is raising fighting pit bulls, and she's falling in love with her brother's friend and trying to make their way through this kind of adolescence. and all the problems that go along with poverty and racism. And then on top of things, a hurricane is coming to destroy everything. And it is just so incredibly emotionally raw and powerful. And descriptions, particularly I'm thinking of a description in which her brother breaks into a barn, and they're all supposed to be lookouts and watching for the people coming back, and running through the woods. Just incredibly beautiful, powerful, raw, painful book. But I just thought an incredible reading experience. At number 6, I have Disoriented by Nagar Javadi. This is a story, multi-generational story, told by our narrator, whose name is, I think, Kamiya. I may not have that right. She has become essentially escaped from Iran with her family because her parents became political dissidents in Iran. They fled to France. It's a story about her adjustment to being in Iranian exile, living in France. It's a story about her family's history in Iran, her father's, speaking out against both the Shah's government and the Ayatollah's government. It's a story about the struggles faced by members of the LGBTQ plus community in Iran, and stories of her father's family and her mother's family, and ultimately the story of their escape and the big thing that happens during that, and her coming to grips with her own sexual identity and her desire to have kids. There's a lot here, and it's handled, I think, incredibly well, with Javadi acting as a kind of a brilliant storyteller, telling us the stories and involving us in the stories, addressing us to the readers directly. And I just found it to be really great, poignant, sad, powerful, with a sense of humor where it was appropriate. I just really thought it was great. I know that some people on BookTube have not agree with that, and that's fine. I can see how different people would have a different experience reading it. The number 5, I have the most recent book on my list, which is Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. And A Visit from the Goon Squad, Egan essentially creates a fairly unique structure, I think, for a story in which it's almost as though, and when I talked about this earlier, as though it's atoms colliding and shooting off in different directions, or particles colliding and shooting off in different directions, and then some of them coming back together. So it's really a series of stories, of interrelated characters, and we follow one character through one story, and then someone in that story who's also a character becomes the main character in the next story until we get to a point, and then we begin working our way back and unifying some of those people across time, distance, death. It's just a really great story with a lot of music mixed into it, and a lot of kind of pop culture things, which seems to be set somewhat in, or part of it is set somewhat in the near dystopian future. I just thought it was really, really great and inventive and really well done, and just a great piece of writing. So I put it as my number 5. And number 4, I have Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Au, who is an Australian writer, I believe of Japanese descent. And this is an incredibly quiet, almost plotless book about a young woman who goes on a trip to Japan. Or maybe she's of Chinese descent. She goes on a trip to Japan. I believe she was born in Hong Kong. Her mother was raised in Hong Kong. They go on a trip together. And it's about the desire, I think, of both of them, but primarily the daughter, to connect in some way with her mother. And then the failures of those connections to actually take place, and kind of the frustration and the limits we have in making these connections to one another. And there's just some truly beautiful writing. It is, I saw that Britta Bowler did a review of it not long ago. It is an incredibly quiet, not a lot of plot novel, which I think invites us to contemplate the nature of relationships with the people that we love, to contemplate the limits of how close we can get to one another, how much we can know one another. And I just thought it was brilliant and beautiful. And number 3, I have The Colony by Audrey McGee, which was on the Booker Prize long list, but did not make the short list, and therefore obviously did not win. As a matter of fact, all 3 of the next books at one point were on the Booker Prize long list or short list. So The Colony by Audrey McGee tells the story essentially of a group of people living on a fairly isolated island off the coast of Ireland, and they're living there during kind of the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, 1960s, 1970s, and they are essentially invaded in a way by an English artist who goes there to essentially paint nature, to try to have this breakthrough moment to reestablish his career and therefore kind of reconnect in some way, or to take revenge on his ex-wife, and then a French linguist of Algerian descent who goes there to study the language of these people and to encourage them to preserve it. And both men play the role of colonizers. The Englishman taking liberties with what he agreed to do and what he said he would not do, and taking from them and building up the hopes of some of the characters only to crush them, and the Frenchman trying to essentially fix that community in amber by discouraging them from abandoning their language and embracing English. And of course the French and Englishmen come to, loggerheads over that. There's a contrast there between the French colonization in Algeria and the problems there in the late 60s, and the English actions in Northern Ireland during the same time period. In between the chapters, there are little, almost like news snippets in which McGee describes or relates an actual incident of the violence in Northern Ireland to kind of contrast what's going on, and it really kind of leaves us with this idea of this kind of world, this isolated group of people in limbo, not exactly sure what to do, what steps to take. Merid is my favorite character here. She is the mother of a young man who befriends the Englishman and who the Englishman teaches how to paint. I think she's an extraordinary character, and I feel like I'm the only one who talks about that, but I thought she was really great. I think the book is great. And number two, nobody should be surprised that Jan Foss's third volume of the Septology, which is titled A New Name, made it to my number two. I think Foss is going to win the award for coming in second most often on my top 10 list. These books, the Septology, what is it? Another Name, A New Name, I Is Another, are just incredible works of writing, incredible feats of writing with just beautiful, repetitive, rhythmic, intertwining storylines and slow accumulation of details and understanding. Just a true feat of writing, and beautiful and powerful and emotional. I'm not an unemotional person. I'm not one of those people who, I won't tell you I never cry, but I don't usually tear up reading books. This is an exception to that. I just thought they were just extraordinary and beautiful, and it's very difficult to describe. I would encourage anyone to pick up the first one and to see if the writing itself affects you in the way that it affected me. And if I could take all three of the Septology volumes, they would be my number one book probably for the last 2 years collectively. But my number one book for this year, I don't think anybody would be surprised. I think I've been saying this since February. My number one book of the year is The Trees by Percival Everett. Just a remarkable work in all kinds of ways. It is satire, oftentimes really broad satire, satirizing racism and the South and the way in which in Southern society African Americans are viewed. There's a little bit of magical realism here with these groups able to pull off these kind of revenge killings in almost mystical ways. There is history here, history of lynching and Emmett Till, etc. There is reverence for the victims of lynching in the South, and where all their names essentially appear, even those without a name, regardless of whether or not they were Black or Vietnamese or Hispanic or Native Americans, all there in this kind of brilliantly told story, which centers around Money, Mississippi, the place where Emmett Till was killed by a group of white men who were then found not guilty of his murder. His mother famously had an open casket funeral for him back home in Detroit, displaying his gruesomely disfigured body, and that gruesomely disfigured body plays a role because we begin to see white members of the Money, Mississippi community are killed, and when a white man dies, there is this disfigured black body resembling that of Emmett Till there, oftentimes usually holding his testicles in their hand. And this kind of situation accelerates and it brings in more people. And the two black detectives who are part of the Mississippi Bureau of Investigations, the MBI, come to town, and they feel the racism of the police and the community, and their relationship to one another, I think, is note perfect and reminds me, now that I've read them, of A Rage in Harlem by Chester Himes, and the relationship between those two detectives. And the story then goes broader. It goes beyond just Emmett Till and Money, Mississippi, and it involves and kind of draws our attention to racist killings and lynchings that have taken place in the 20th century, you know, really throughout American history and across all kinds of different groups. I just thought it was remarkable and easily my best book of the year. Anyway, there you go. There are my top 10 novels of 2022, my best reads of 2022 in terms of fiction. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.